there's the propaganda that banana companies push that you can't like put bananas in the fridge or they go bad because they turn brown, but on the inside they're still fine. It's just something that banana companies pushed in like the 50s to sell more bananas, so you don't put your bananas in the fridge. Same thing. Oh, and also just the whole thing, what you brought up about Margaret Sanger, it just like reminds me of just like right wingers latch on to things like Margaret Sanger and like try and turn them like wild conspiracy theories. I mean, which whatever. I enjoy conspiracy theories, but they like latch onto that. Now, anytime you bring up the fact that Margaret Sanger was problematic and had like a bunch of issues, you get like attached to them. Like it's like you get like linked as if you're like basically that you believe that she's like a lizard person or something like that. So
yeah, you don't need the lizard person conspiracies. Like Bill Gates is saying it openly in the New York Times that Africa needs to depopulate, and he's pushing birth control, and all sorts of methods of depopulation in Africa, using billions of dollars to do it. So that the conspiracies are real, and you can just Google them pretty much.
Yeah, I mean that's the irony about the U.S. political vision or views or tendencies, is that in some ways both sides, like the two main heads that we see, the liberals and the conservatives, in some ways they're both seeing elements of truth, right? Because when liberals point out, we defend LGBTQ rights as communists, yeah, we support that, right? We support helping poor and working class people. That's what the liberals talk about. And representation, we support that as well, obviously from a different perspective. But then conservatives, they'll point out things like populism, right? Like, and we'll agree with that when we talk about like the swamp and DC, these elites who run the system. I agree with that to a certain extent. When they tend to be, also the right wing tends to be a little bit more quote conspiratorial, or at least more open to hearing about things like plans within the government to do certain things. But then it's just interesting because then the right wing will take it. They always bring it back to China somehow. It's always China, evil. So it's subverted too, So it's like somebody who's conspiratorial minded, I think, is somebody who's a critical thinker. Like if you question 9/11, if you question these things, but then the right wing subverts it and brings it. Oh, China's the reason, right? But then the left, the liberal Democrats do that as well. Where they're like, yeah, we support LGBTQ fighter pilots bombing Afghanistan. So it's like in both ways, they're both bringing you back to like the wrong decision, and we're only seen with these two options. And ironically enough, that's also what Bernays in many ways did. Is like, it's like Coke or Pepsi. Well, they're both fucking horrible for you. They both kill you. So why even fit into this false dichotomy? So it's like by presenting these two options, false options, you're being shepherded into this alternative, this third alternative that has been designed for you. And in many ways, that is what has happened. That has been one of the biggest problems facing the U.S. left in particular, the left in general. I'm not sure if you guys ever met people who are like, I'm not left or right. I'm my own thing, or this is what happens with a lot of anarchists too, right? Where they're like, the left is just as bad. The communist is just as bad as capitalists. Like I'm independent. I'm my own thing. Well, it's like, okay, by doing that, you're following the path. Like that's how they want you to, they're shepherding you into that false third position where you just lose hope in everything. But by default, you're still supporting capitalism, and it's like, it's designed to do that. And this is like, these are some of the techniques that Edward Bernays did, going into Guatemala in particular. So you have Edward Bernays, who was hired by a United Fruit Company, which today still exists as Chiquita Brands International. He was hired to basically promote the sale of bananas. And one of the things that he did was hitting up celebrities at the time and sending them bananas and asking them to take pictures with it and just putting it out there, right? Having subconscious branding, just sending out bananas and having everybody promote it. And basically, he became very involved with the United Fruit Company, which we know at the time had a whole empire. My family in Honduras actually the nickname Banana Republic actually comes from Honduras, where my family's from, and Honduras was one of the biggest colonies for the United Fruit Company in the 1950s, and was heavily destroyed by people like Edward Bernays because of some of the techniques of not only like it, so it's interesting because my grandfather, he was a union organizer in Honduras, and he was active in, my family's from the northern coast of Honduras, where is a lot of bananas and plantains are grown. And anybody who was union organizing, who was a labor activist, because the conditions were fucking horrible. At any point, if you were organizing, you were branded as a communist, which we know at that time to be a communist in Latin America in the 50s was pretty bad, you know? So you were murdered, you were just straight up massacred. And there were so many massacres that we can point to of banana workers. And so that was one of the techniques that Bernays perfected, is like, you had like scaring the crap out of people and basically drumming up fear and going into these things about the communist menace and the Soviet, you're just Soviet agents, right? And this is, it's interesting because this happens even today whenever you defend Russia and Putin. When we talk about Ukraine, when people are like, oh, you're a Putin sympathizer and agent. And like, he kind of pioneered Russophobia in many ways, in particular when it comes to fruit workers and banana workers, because he would design these posters that they would use and translate to Spanish of like Russian octopus, or they would have like Stalin as like an octopus going into Latin America and being like, you know, you're a communist Asian if you're trying to organize unions. And so this is, you know, this hits close to home for me because in Honduras, the so-called Banana Republic, like he was crafting a lot of these spells, which even to this day have played such a major role in making people, exactly that. This is the kind of propaganda that they would use, that the United Fruit Company and Edward Bernays would put out there to make it seem like if you were fighting for your rights in any ways, even if you were not communist in any way, you were an agent of the Soviet Union. And so this played a major role in, as the comrade mentioned in the chat, in the 1954 coup against Jacobo Arbenz, who was the president of Guatemala, not a communist at all, by the way. He was like a liberal. Interestingly enough, this was the time period during which Ernesto Che Guevara was radicalized. It was during Ernesto Che Guevara's visit to Honduras and Guatemala, where Ernesto Che Guevara said one of his most famous quotes. I'm going to paraphrase here, but he says something along the lines of, I will not rest until I slay. No, he said, I pray. He's like, I pray before a picture of Comrade Stalin that I will not rest my arms until I slash the tentacles of this capitalist octopus known as the United Fruit Company. It's a beautiful quote, and his journey through Honduras and Guatemala were very, very pivotal in his political transformation as a communist, as a Marxist, where he met a lot of indigenous peoples who were fighting the United Fruit Company. And the coup happened, right? So Jacobo Arbenz was the president of Guatemala. He was liberal, left-leaning. He wasn't like a communist in any way, but he wanted to nationalize a lot of the agriculture industry and introduce labor laws, basic, simple stuff. And of course, Edward Bernays played a major role in branding him as a communist subversive, as an agent of the Soviet Union, and basically putting out this propaganda. And what's interesting is that Edward Bernays, at that time period, he was the sole correspondent for a lot of these major publications at the time. Again, he was working for U.S. intelligence. He was working for Israeli intelligence. And he was the person on the ground reporting about all this information, which ended up so he was supplying all the stories to the agencies, right? Like he was crafting that narrative to Newsweek, to Time Magazine, the New York Herald Tribune, which existed at the time, the New York Times. He was like the source. You know, when the New York Times comes up with these bullshit stories, like an unidentified source, sources say, it's like, who are these sources, right? Edward Bernays was one of these sources who was crafting this narrative that eventually led to Jacobo Arbenz's overthrow in Operation PB Success, the coup d'etat that overthrew him, carried out by the CIA. And afterward, that coup led to basically 40 years of violence carried out by the right-wing Guatemalan military dictatorship against militant revolutionary indigenous groups and labor groups that were fighting for their rights. So, his Edward Bernays, again, like this hits close to home. This is not something that is in the abstract. This is not something that, and think about it like this, right? In many ways, Edward Bernays and his propaganda and his spellcraft was responsible for these wars in Central America. And these wars in Central America were responsible for mass migration during the 80s and the 90s and even to this day. So it's all connected, it's all interrelated, and that's just a sense of who he was and what he did.